Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. This is A Moral Action. I am your host, Jeffrey Joseph, your friendly neighborhood youth minister. And here with me today is my special guest, my very good and close friend, and a former roommate and former colleague at Boston College, the Storman, former Norman, Levi Checkets. Welcome to the pod. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing well. If you're on the West Coast or Mountain Standard Time, good morning. If you're in Central Time or Eastern Time, good afternoon. It's good to be here on the show.
Awesome. So, as we set up this podcast and what it'll be about, it'll mostly be about ethics and morality. Levi and I both have a background in moral theology from Boston College, but we have a lot of common interests that veer outside of strictly theological ethics and ethics, as is part of the point of the show, the name of the show, a moral action. Every action is a moral action. It just depends on how much you're willing to think about it. And so we'll be talking about all manner of things. But before we get into all of that, Levi, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, about where you came from, and I've already introduced you as the Storm and Former Mormon, so I've tipped my hat a little bit, but talk a little about where you came from and what your family life was like and how you ended up in theology.
Um, I don't know if I would say I'm originally from Utah, but I guess I would. My father was in the military when I was born, but he and my mom are both from Utah. All of my extended relatives are from Utah, and that might lead you to not be surprised when I say that most of my family then is LDS, is Mormon. And so I grew up as a member of the LDS Church. Tried to be a faithful, good Mormon kid until college. When I decided my senior year of high school, had enough of living in Utah, and wanted to get out of the state as wherever I could go. So I applied to a bunch of colleges. Was stupid, high school student, didn't have very good guidance counselors in my high school. All of them were like, yeah, you should apply to BYU, you should apply to University of Utah, you should apply to Utah State. What if I want to go outside of the state? Oh, well, I don't know. So I did this search on College Board's website for what I wanted to study, and at that time I wanted to be a CIA agent, sort of. And of course, that sounds silly now to say, but that was my idea, and so I wanted to study Arabic. So I looked for colleges that had good language programs, and most of them at that point in time I didn't know. I see Middlebury College. What's Middlebury College? And now I'm like, oh, I should have gone to Middlebury College.
I still don't
But
know what Military College is, so continue.
so one of the ones that came up that I did know, well, two of the ones that came up that I did know were Dartmouth and Notre Dame. And as I as I said, I was sort of doing this blindly. It was probably December of my senior year when I'm actually doing applications. I'd already taken the SAT and all of that. So I can't get into Dartmouth because they want SAT 2 tests. And so I apply to Notre Dame, and as luck would have it, I get in. It's really stupidly, you know, I'm the only person in my school, from my high school, to ever go to Notre Dame. Um, I was probably the only one in my graduating class to go to a top 20 college.
Hmm.
And I showed up there the first day for freshman orientation and realized that I wasn't in Kansas, as they say. So I spent my first year there. I was still pretty good faithful Mormon. I tried to be. I didn't really go to church as much as I could have. Part of it was because there wasn't a chapel nearby. Part of it was just enjoying freedom. But I didn't lose my faith my freshman year. But I did take theology class because it was required at Notre Dame, and it
Hmm.
began making me think about some things. And one of the things that it really made me think about was whether or not I believe the founding principles of the Mormon Church. Things like the Great Apostasy, meaning that around the time that the apostles died, or maybe shortly thereafter, Christianity became corrupted. The Holy Spirit left the earth, something to that effect. And only when Joseph Smith prayed to God in 1830 or 1820 did God's presence come back? So that's a big part of Mormon theology. And a lot of what I was studying in theology at Notre Dame sort of threw that into question, where people like Thomas Aquinas or Francis of Assisi or Teresa of Avila, were they not talking to God? Were their experiences of God and their love of God genuine? Or so my sophomore year, I began questioning a lot more, and as I began questioning, I found that the answers I found from the Mormon Church weren't satisfactory. And at the end of my sophomore year, I decided that, well, probably around the end of the first semester, I decided that I was going to leave the Mormon Church. But it wasn't um, until my spring semester, I had a religious experience on a retreat and felt called. And this is one of the few times in my life I really felt called, but felt called to become Catholic. So junior year of college, I entered RCIA, and at this point, I was already was already a theology major. So my my godmother knew less about Catholic theology than I did.
Hmm.
I was baptized because if you're Mormon, you have to be baptized in the Catholic Church. You don't just get the confirmation. I was baptized and had confirmation and all that. Easter of my junior year, senior year, I decided, well, I was an Arabic major as well. I decided not to pursue the Arabic dream, but to pursue theology. Applied to Boston College, where met you. You know that part of the story.
A
I guess
little bit.
maybe doesn't.
Thank God you decided not to be a cunning linguist, indeed. Theology all the way.
Um, and then the rest of the story is kind of history. We got to Boston College. Both of us studied moral theology. Um, we both of us applied to PhD programs. I got and that's really competitive. Somehow I ended up getting into the GTU, the Graduate Theological Union, along with my wife, and that's where I am now. 3 years into the program, not anywhere close to finishing, but on my way, I guess.
Right. And I think part of what I think is fascinating about your faith story is like you and I, in a lot of ways, I feel like we have the inverse faith stories as far as background. Like you come from a very Mormon background and then converted to Catholicism, whereas I come from a background of people, the Canaanite Catholics, who they're all the Syrian Indians who believe they have a Jewish background that came from Syria in the 6th or 7th century and have been Christians and ostensibly Catholics for the last 1400 years. And yet here I am, just another cog basically in this grand machine of Canaanite Catholics. Although for the most part they generally don't want anything to do with me and probably tend to think I'm there to clean the washroom rather than actually attend mass at their services. But that's Canaanite Catholics. So while you and I both have reactions against some of our upbringing, we both go about it in different ways. And obviously, I have a reaction against Canaanite Catholics for very particular reasons, and that's what I ended up writing my master's thesis about. Is not Canaanite Catholics particularly, but about South Asians and the way that they treat women and things like that, and the not just objectification of women, but just the general impression that women have a lesser space in society than men and deserve to have a lesser space. And actually, the recent, I don't know if you saw the recent discussion of one of the men who, and these stories are getting more common that it's kind of hard to narrow it down, but one of the men who gang raped a woman and killed her, and they had written, or not, they'd recorded a documentary discussing these things with the prisoners who were, uh, fortunately, they were caught and they'll face trial and things like that. And one of the guys who did it, who was the bus driver, he said that effectively, that not effectively, he said the woman should not have resisted, and then she would have been alive. So it was her fault that she died, not taking any culpability for the fact that he and his brother and others gang raped this woman, whose only sin, as it were, was to be out at 8 o'clock at night, because that's such a terrible thing for a woman to do. Um, so it's that sort of culture that I play against, and you have a different culture that you've reacted toward in terms of the way that interpreted the Holy Spirit and its actions and things like that. But nonetheless, they brought us both to this place, Boston College, where we learned about moral theology and the power that it can have. Uh, but among other things, I know that you want to talk about, and it's something that's been making the rounds, and I think it's worth talking about, is this idea that stemmed a lot from the New York Times article. I don't remember the author's name, but the New York Times article about whether our schools are teaching our kids that there are no moral facts, right? So if you could talk a little bit about this, because this is definitely more in your wheelhouse, because it's more of a philosophy argument in the first place.
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's something that um, it's difficult to pinpoint where it comes from. I mean, chronologically, where this idea comes from. But there's this idea that is prevalent in some parts of society, certainly within certain branches of moral philosophy, particularly people who are socially conservative,
Mm-hmm.
that our society is becoming morally more corrupt, and that the truths that we once espoused no longer espouse, or we no longer espouse. In fact, one of the most important ethical texts of the 20th century, Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, is entirely premised on this idea that we no longer have a common moral language, that people no longer accept the same moral truths we once did, that people are becoming more relativistic, that what I think is right and what you think are right doesn't matter because there's no absolute moral certainty. And it's this idea that people have tried to articulate that that is something going on, that people are becoming less morally certain. But there's always something interesting in looking at the discussion of what's going on there. So um, the example that you mentioned, the New York Times article, the author specifically mentions the issue of cheating in the academic setting. And at this point, I teach a couple classes here and there, and it is a problem. Students cheat in the academic setting, and any professor or teacher who deals with that realizes how heartbreaking that can be. But it is something that does happen. The question, though, is, and this is something we don't really have good data for, is whether that's a new phenomenon, and whether and if it isn't, or if it is a new phenomenon, either way, where that stems from, where that the impulse to cheat comes from. Um, the most obvious answer, which we can't really verify unless we do some research into this, the most obvious answer is it's a utilitarian view of education, that I only need to get a good grade in order to graduate so I can get a good job. So it doesn't matter if I actually learn this stuff, if I actually do my best, I have to get that A. Um, but what's more interesting to me is that the professor, or he calls himself a philosopher, the author of that particular opinion piece, makes cheating his standard for morality. And there was another piece that I had sent to you. There was a similar piece in the Deseret News, a newspaper run out of Utah. It's primarily interested in LDS culture, LDS news, but they do report actual non-LDS news. But there was an opinion piece in that newspaper as well that drew off of a lot of the same ideas. And the person who wrote that piece talked about morality in terms of sexual license.
Mm-hmm.
So what's interesting is when people talk about moral relativism and that our society is, going to hell in a handbasket, they mean something particular. They mean some specific set of ethics is different or is changed or is not what they expect. And this brings about certain questions that we really have to be attentive to, and I think they're worth asking. It might be the case, for example, that sexual morality is different now than it was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It might be the case that people cheat on their exams and their papers more now than they did 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. again, it's difficult to say without having some concrete data, and it's difficult to, find data about adultery or fornication from 50 or 60 years ago. But even if we take this as true, the question that we have to then ask is, what about other issues of ethics? Because, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, every action is a moral action. So if we're just labeling morality as sexual sexual issue,
Propriety of some kind,
hmm?
sexual propriety of some kind or another.
Right? Or if we're labeling morality just as being in the classroom and being honest, then we're really narrowing the scope of morality. So the
Hmm.
question then that we should begin asking is whether it is true that we're less morally conscious now than we were before. And I think we begin seeing that probably not. We're probably more morally conscious now than we've been before. And I mean, we can think of a lot of different examples that prove that, or that show that. Maybe not prove it, but show that. Environmental consciousness would be one example.
Hmm.
Racial consciousness would be another example. Talking about gender differences and gender inequality would be another example. There's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about the wealth difference in the United States and other countries. And that's another example, right?
Sure.
Police brutality, police accountability, political corruption, right? These are all ethical issues. And if we're more aware of them, if we're paying more attention to them, that doesn't show that we're less morally attentive. It shows that we're, in fact, more morally attentive.
Right. And just for those viewing, you may have already seen that I've been trying to share both of these articles that we've been talking about. So you should be able to click on those. The one from the newspaper most recently I was talking about is March Moral Madness, Facts versus Values. And as I mentioned, the other one was the New York Times article. So if you want to check those out independently, feel free. Levi has brought up a host of topics, and I'll try to respond to at least some of them. I know that I've seen studies that indicate that they've discussed or tried to interview people who have been alive since the 40s and 50s and ask them about whether or not they had, for example, premarital sex, because that seems to be the idea that, oh, there's this bygone era where people never had premarital sex. And I believe the statistic was something like over 90% of them agreed that they absolutely had premarital sex. So this impression that we have of, oh, in the 50s and 60s when our morals were grand and pure and perfect, that totally does not exist. And it seems that sociologically that seems to be a recurring theme, is that every era thinks that the era before it was better in some way, shape, or form. And particular to me is youth ministry, so I've had to analyze things in terms of how generationally values change from, for example, Generation Y, sort of millennials, to Generation Z, which is the upcoming generation that's coming through high school and moving forward. And actually, I watched a presentation, not from a theological perspective, it was actually from a business perspective, where they're trying to analyze what's different about Generation Z. What they found were that just as Generation Y, for example, actually had, to allude to this sexual morality thing, is that they had less premarital sex than the generation before it. And Generation Z has even less premarital sex than Generation Y. So this idea that all these kids are just all hooking up all the time and sharing all kinds of venereal disease and all of that, that seems, at best, that seems overblown. But talking about other issues of ethics and where people want to go, where this new generation wants to go career-wise, for example, Generation Y, the millennials, are often called the boomerang generation because they went to college and then they couldn't find jobs because of the Great Recession, and then they came home. But what effect that had on Generation Z, this newest generation, is that they're more understanding and accommodating of this idea that we have to live in a multi-generational home, that we have to understand how to work not just ourselves and not be focused on ourselves, but focused on all the people around us. And how that's affected their career thoughts is that many of them are no longer interested in all these high-paying jobs exclusively, in terms of trying to just generate capital and have the big home and a big estate and just have all kinds of money coming in for their immediate family and what have you. In fact, many of them are now geared primarily toward what will do the most good. So in light of that, you would think that actually this might be one of the more moral generations that we've had in the last century, given that they are more concerned about others than they are strictly about themselves. Uh, but I want to offer this counterclaim at least, because I think while that all of that is true, and I've seen that illustrated with the teens that I've had to work with, and also in the studies that have borne it out, in a link that I shared with you, and I can try to share here. Um, we also have this impression that, for example, that millennials live in a post-racial era, right? Because, and actually, studies have indicated that a lot of this impression is almost exclusively because we happen to have a black man as president. So we have this impression that, well, we had a black man as president. That means everybody has equal opportunity. There's no more work to be done. All of the racial inequality we've ever imagined, it's all disappeared. But as this article from Sean McElwee that was posted on Politico suggests, millennials are actually probably more racist than they think. Among other things, one of the things that I found interesting, and he talks about a lot of different biases, and he has lots of links to different articles suggesting that after the Great Recession, racial inequality in terms of income has only been exacerbated rather than reduced. But among other things, he notes that 58% of white millennials believe that white people are just as likely to get discriminated against as people of other ethnicities. And I find that fascinating in that we live in a country where, for example, in the I believe it was the 2012 primaries, they were polling. I think it was Mississippi, but I could be wrong on this. But they were polling prospective Republicans who were voting in the primary, and 50% of them, a solid 50% of them, believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim, which flies in the face of everything that he has said transparently as president, and alludes more to just the fear that people have of a black president as president. And then we've also seen so many of the hate groups and things that spawned as a result of him winning the election, the first election in 2008, and continuing on through 2012 when he won again.
Right.
Do you have any particular thoughts on racism, or just the back and forth, I guess, between millennials and morality growing or receding?
That's a lot of material to think about. I would say one of the things that struck me, I want to say this was about the 2012 election, but this might have been the 2008. In looking at demographics, voting for this must have been 2012, voting for President Obama or Governor Romney, it was very interesting, the split, and this was a sort of like a lot of Republicans jumped on this. That, look, all of the minorities are voting for President Obama when all of the white people are voting for Mitt Romney. And that's actually quite shocking, because if you paid attention to Mitt Romney's campaign, he didn't seem like a very strong contender. I know that's sort of maybe that might offend some listeners, but he really seemed to be out of touch in a lot of ways. And if it is the case that most of the people who voted for him were white, and most white men voted for him, if I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was a very small percentage of white men voted for Barack Obama. More women voted for President Obama than men. And for every ethnic minority group, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, the majority of each ethnic group voted for President Obama rather than Mitt Romney.
Right.
That doesn't just tell us that, well, that doesn't mean, well, all of those minority groups, they sympathize with President Obama. It tells us that all of those white guys sympathize with Mitt Romney, right? It's not just that people of color are voting for President Obama. It's people who are white are not voting for President Obama for whatever reason, right? And if we don't say that it's racism, we have to actually ask, what's going on. And this, I think, this goes into the question. I think people who are millennials are probably less likely to attribute things that are racially based as things that are racially based. I remember with discussions around the death of Mike Brown and Officer, what's his name? Darren Wilson, discussions about what happened with what Officer Wilson did. And a lot of people I'd see on Facebook discussing the issue when Officer Wilson was acquitted by the grand jury. Um, it was a sort of people wanted to say, well, it's not about racism. Officer Wilson wasn't being racist. He didn't shoot Mike Brown because he was black. He shot him because why? Because he stole two cigars. Really? We don't shoot people for stealing cigars. That's
Right.
why we that's why we arrest people because we don't shoot them for small crimes. Because Mike Brown was intimidating. Really, Mike Brown didn't have a gun, and Officer Wilson did.
Mm-hmm.
Officer Wilson also had a car that he was in while Mike Brown was on foot. And it's really difficult to defend this position. But what's more shocking is that a lot of the people who are defending Officer Wilson's actions in that case are the same kind of people who defended Cliven Bundy
Mm-hmm.
for threatening to use women as shields if the government came and took his stuff. I mean, it's a sort of we're racist, but we don't want to acknowledge it as racism, and that is a problem for overcoming racism, not overcoming race, but overcoming racism. If we don't acknowledge it as racism, then we can't correct it. I remember a while ago there was a meme floating around on at least my conservative Facebook friends' walls about Morgan Freeman supposedly said that the way to get rid of racism was to ignore it. But that's obviously not true. And Morgan Freeman isn't an expert on race relations. He happens to be African American, yes, but he also happens to be a very privileged African American. He's a very well respected actor. People love the sound of his voice. People picture him as God. I mean, this is very different from your average black man living in West Oakland, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think that's one of the issues, as you said, having a black man as president. A lot of people say, well, racism is over, or when racist uh, problems occur, a lot of people are very quick to justify them as it's not about racism, it's about something else, right? When a 12-year-old boy is shot by police before they even stop the car for playing with a BB gun, it's very difficult to say that there's nothing about racism going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in terms of millennials, I think the problem is that there has been a lot of discourse about racism, and a lot of people think that either the discourse has fixed things or that the discourse is overblown. And that's my take. I'm not exactly sure if that would be. I mean, it would be difficult to prove either one of those to be the case, but it does seem that it's not a matter of uh, well, I mean, this is something we've talked about before. People don't like to be called racist now,
Right. It's
and
very
we
true.
don't typically see the kind of racism that we saw 60 years ago, where people shout out the N-word, where African Americans are lynched. Although that did happen recently in
It's true.
Mississippi,
Mm-hmm.
we don't see that as much now, and so we think that those days are gone. Um, it's a sort of thing that now it's a bigger challenge because it's more subtle,
Mm-hmm.
right? To say it's very difficult. It's very easy. Sorry, it's very easy to say to not use derogatory terms or to cause violence to people, and it's very difficult to change attitudes and mindsets, right? One of
Mm-hmm.
those takes a lot more conscious effort. The other one takes conscious non-effort, right? Don't hit that person.
Mm-hmm.
Don't use that word. Don't be part of a mob or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So
And I,
I'm
I actually
okay.
think part of this is I think this contributes to an idea that I've sort of been developing, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this. But in terms of like inaction, or it's one step removed, like modern racism, as it is defined as a term, really is that it's not something that's going to be as transparently racist as what we've had in the past. Of course, in our lovely, wonderful golden bygone eras, we were still having regular lynchings. Like, how do you reconcile those two things in terms of if it was such a pristine era, why was all this happening, right? Um,
Right.
but of course, we have more subtle racism now, and I think part of it is because we do live in the internet age, right? We do live in the era of immediately sharing everything. And actually, another thing that I think is interesting is that the most modern generation, the Generation Z, whereas Generation Y, millennials, tended to overshare, Generation Z is more cognizant of the perils of that. And so that's why things like Snapchat are becoming more popular and Facebook are less popular because they're things that immediately will eliminate themselves. Unless you manage to get that screen grab, that disappears entirely. So even if you make a fault or a slight somehow, that there's a good chance that that will disappear immediately, so you're not culpable for that. And I think part of the reason why people have this impression of Generation Y and Z for having this semblance of moral relativism is because we've lived in a world where there's an immediate reaction often to whatever we do, and if we make even small mistakes, then those will be magnified a thousandfold exponentially. They'll be gone. They'll go viral, and people will immediately react to that around the nation. For example, like the University of Oklahoma frat, which I'm sure you saw, they had a racist chant, and then
Right.
that became an entire national issue. And I think these two generations are way more cognizant of that. So they may be a little less likely to initially put fault on one person or another person's beliefs. Part of it is we're just more aware of other people's beliefs and maybe even more accepting of that. But uh, in tandem with that is another thing that Sean McElwee talked about on another podcast, actually, which I don't remember if he particularly specifically put it in the article, but what he said was that generationally racism persists. It's just that when people are polled and asked things that are most transparently racist, like, do you think that Asians are terrible drivers or something like that, they would say no. But then if they're asked a question that's just a little bit less transparently racist, like, do you think that black people are responsible for their own socioeconomic conditions, however poor they may be? And then they'll say yes. And that almost always, at least as far as he suggested, uh, paralleled whatever happened with the previous generation within their family. So if their parents were racist, they internalized that racism. They just internalized it slightly differently. So it just has to be phrased a little bit better, and then they will assent to this racist ideal. But since it's not something that could be easily explained, it's not something you could put on Twitter and say, "Oh, that was a totally terribly racist thing." Um, there's a little bit of wiggle room, and they have not yet discerned how that too is just another form of racism. But I wonder
Right.
what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, again, that's a lot of material. With regards to the first one, I think I think combating subtle racism is something that does take awareness, and I think it takes re-education. My hope is that as certain pockets of the population become more ethnically diverse,
Hmm.
we might begin seeing that certain racist attitudes or racist beliefs dissolve. But of course, that's not a very proactive stance, and that's probably part of the problem with the later generations that you're mentioning. Um, with regards to the sharing or blaming, I think I'm not exactly sure that I agree with you there. I recall a few months ago, or maybe it was a year or so ago, the founder of Mozilla, of
Hmm.
Firefox, was being harassed on the internet for having donated money to an organization about a decade ago, which had supported anti-gay rights, or was anti-gay rights, not supported, but and he was being harassed through. I'm not exactly sure what was going on. It might have been DDoS, or it might have been something along those lines. But for something he had done a long time ago, something that doesn't really is not really as a very strong action compared to other things that we can do. So there is a risk for overreaction from some pockets of the internet, and this is something that I'm actually quite interested in for my own work. That I think that one of the problems with the internet is that it does provide opportunities for encountering other people and realizing how small mistakes can last forever, and we have to be more tolerant, et cetera, et cetera. But it also creates the ability to essentially be in an echo chamber.
Sure.
It's sort of like, I live in Berkeley, California right now, and when I talk to people in Berkeley, California, if I mention something that a conservative would largely agree with, I get a very strong negative reaction. But if I
Hmm.
talk about things like women's rights, LGBT rights, um, African Americans' rights, Asian Americans' rights, Latino Americans' rights, I get a lot of resounding support for those sorts of things here in Berkeley and in the Bay Area. If I go to, where my parents live in Vernal, Utah, it's the opposite. If I say something somewhat racist or somewhat, you know, socially conservative, that we need to lower taxes because we're taxing people too much, then I would get resounding support for that. The
Sure.
internet does the same thing where in a place like Chicago, you might encounter people from both sides of the spectrum. You might encounter people who are conservative or who are liberal, and being able to associate with different people can help balance out your views so that you don't realize that so that you realize that certain views are crazy and other
Hmm.
views are also crazy. On the internet, you can have your views supported by groups of like-minded people. And one of the most terrifying examples of this would be groups like the Red Pill, men's rights groups, Stormfront, other groups where people who are reacting against women, minorities, ethnic minorities, and other elements of society that are beginning to assert their voices more, people people band together to oppose those. And so you see
Hmm.
racist groups popping up with more strength and more fervor on the internet. You see misogynist groups popping up with more strength and fervor on the internet because you've got voices telling you, yeah, you're right, not, no, you're crazy.
Right. And I don't think we disagree on this. I mean, I think there is both the way that we have sort of learned to, on some level, maybe to protect ourselves, but also absolutely that the echo chamber has resounded. I mean, what are comment boards known for other than being just terrible, awful places that you should never exist?
Right,
And even whatever steps we've taken, including forcing people to have their Facebook account attached to it before they can make a comment on a website, that has done little or nothing to actually limit what terrible things people will do or say on comment sections for articles. So, that is absolutely the case, and I think actually that has also certainly paralleled itself in the way the media is presented, right? Like the way the media had been up until the late 90s was that there was at least some semblance of trying to be uh, objective in reporting, and then Fox News decided that they were going to take things in a totally different direction, and perhaps most tellingly, that worked. Like what they refer to as the mainstream media is no longer the mainstream media because Fox News is the most watched news network. That is objectively the case, for better or worse. And as somebody who worked on Turn Off Fox for years, I obviously think it's for the worst. But nonetheless, uh, that has changed the way that we view the media. And if the big time media, like Fox News or MSNBC, trying to do it for the other side, if they think that's totally acceptable, why wouldn't that be all the more acceptable on a grassroots level with all the organizations that you're talking about?
right. Yeah, and that's certainly. I mean, I think that's one of the big problems, and I think this is why this is one of the risks of globalism in on a broad scale. Hannah Arendt talks about mass media as a problem that and she's writing in the 50s, so mass media back then was the newspapers and the radio, right? It wasn't Fox News, it wasn't internet forums, it was the radio and it was the newspaper. And she said that the problem with that is that it really polarizes people. It brings sort of levels out all discussion, and so there's no real interaction. There's no deep communication. But I want to go back to your question about the golden age of morality and
Sure.
racism. And I think this is key to think about because I think when people talk about morality becoming relativized, what they mean is that the things that they or that certain people whom they idealize viewed as the correct moral standard no longer is viewed in that light. So, although, as you mentioned, there was a high rate of premarital sex before, I mean, forever, there was a strong narrative that said it was not going on and that it was wrong.
Sure.
Today, there's less of a narrative about that. So, premarital sex may be down, but people are more culturally accepting of it. On
Hmm.
the other hand, during that golden time when it was the father who worked and the mom who stayed at home and took care of the kids and the children were obedient and they said yes mother, no dad. These this was a time when we had terrible racism going on. I mean, we still have terrible racism, but racism that resulted in lots of violence against African Americans. We had the problems surrounding immigrant workers that Cesar Chavez rallied against. I mean, if we look at the tumult during the 1960s that even persisted through the 90s, this is all because what we thought was moral turned out to not be moral or turned out to be bad morals.
Hmm.
Uh, so the fact that we rejected certain moral ideas doesn't mean that we've turned to moral relativism. It doesn't mean that we have gotten rid of all sense of value and that we just sort of like say, well, Jeffrey, if you decide you want to go kill people, that's fine with you because I'm just going to go help the homeless and that's fine with me. And there's no, neither of us is right and neither of us is wrong. No,
Hmm.
we actually do have moral values, but they've changed. And this is part of it's sometimes looking at other. This is again why I say this is the work of mostly social conservatives because the work of, for example, feminists will say what we consider to be good morality is typically the patriarchal system that the
Hmm.
father works and he tells his when he comes home his wife makes him a martini and takes off his slippers and asks how was your day hun rather than something more practical more realistic more fair to women and children and people of different ethnic groups and people who are not heterosexual and people of different income brackets, right? We're looking at a more equal system, or at least a more equal ideal. Whether or not it's more equal is, it seems not to be the case. But
Right.
we're changing our values, and that doesn't mean that we're relativizing them. It just means that we're changing them.
Yeah, I think I would have to agree, of course. But I think for me, what's most fascinating about this is that not only is that discussion uh, preponderant, it's so preponderant in the, and I think I just made that word up, but it is so ingrained in our society that when it comes to, for example, pop artists like a Katy Perry or something like that, they don't want to self-identify as feminists, and when asked whether or not they are feminists, they say, no, I'm not really about that, even though probably the simplest understanding of uh, feminism would be that women deserve equal opportunity as men. I mean, at its bare bones. And of course, there are extremes that are much further than that and things like that. But at its simplest, most base form, that's basically what feminism boils down to. And yet, these pop artists, who are actually examples of how women can, in fact, have similar opportunities, have similar success in the industry, and I'm not actually a fan of Katy Perry, so that's a whole other topic. But nonetheless, in terms of her music, but nonetheless, she would think that she would have been somebody who was all for that, but denies it when asked about it because the conversation has been so dominated by this idea that well, feminism is something that's new and something that's extreme, and so either because of the marketability that she would lose if she decided to identify as a feminist, or because of just an actual genuine fear of what feminism is in the modern
Mhm.
day. She
Right.
can't identify with that.
Right. We think of feminists, or there's still a very popular view of feminists as cranky, middle-aged women who are lesbians who wear pantsuits,
Right,
right?
exactly.
Doesn't matter if the what an actual feminist is very different from that, but that's the image, and we don't want to associate ourselves with that image. I wanna mention something as a sort of side note that's very interesting to think about. In McIntyre's book, which I mentioned at the beginning of the session, um, I told you his premise is that we're in a period of moral relativism, and that we have to return to something that's more consistent. And this is why it's called after virtue, because for him, there was some period when everything was virtuous, everybody followed the virtue system, and that became destroyed through the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation, and those darned Protestants.
Yeah, gosh. Why don't they just stop protesting already?
But when he actually talks about the development of virtue, he has this strange. I mean, the reader who pays attention will notice he actually contradicts himself because
Mhm.
he says very clearly that at no point was there one system of virtue. Not even in Athens, not even in the glorious time of Aristotle. There were competing systems of virtue. We have to understand if that's the case, and if it's good that McIntyre is at least being honest and not trying to portray some glorious past that didn't exist. If that's the case, if there have always been competing moral systems, there's actually always been a degree of relativism in any
Right.
society. That doesn't mean that it's good or bad. It does mean, though, we can't say that there's some bygone era where everybody agreed on ethics and now things are different. We have to admit that in the past, there was perhaps a hegemonic idea, the patriarchal view of the father who goes, works, and he lives, makes an honest living, and the wife takes care of the kids at home, and people are sexually faithful to each other, and African Americans get lynched because they walk down the wrong side of the street, right?
Hmm.
We can think that that was one system, but we also have to recognize that there were other systems, that there were people who said, no, this isn't a good system. There were African Americans who said being lynched is not a good moral system. There were women who were saying at that time it's not good to just tell women to stay in the home and have babies. There were lots of people who were saying, hey, this idea of sexual faithfulness is good, but you guys are actually out having premarital sex and having affairs and all that. And so you're not actually living what you said.
Hmm.
So we have to realize that when people say, we lost this, we're in a period of relativism, it's really more of a rhetorical flourish than based on any sort of historical accuracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you've talked about a lot of different examples, and we can talk about examples within the Catholic Church or the LDS Church you can talk to more than I can. But of course, even like when we think about the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, or in terms of what was done to Galileo because he had the audacity to believe that the center of the universe was not the Earth. We might have moral truths or moral facts, to refer back to this article, the New York Times article, but those seem to change over time, and so there's a reason why there is some value in trying to establish facts versus opinions, and that is actually very important, and it's very important for us as consumers of just life generally, but in terms of understanding politics, in terms of understanding theology, all of the above. There are facts out there that we might be able to verify scientifically, and there might be things perpetuated as facts, and those truths, those moral facts, might change within the next 100 years. And it's not bad for us to choose to understand and reflect on that and say, okay, this actually is more accurate now, and we should subscribe to this. Doesn't make us more relativists. I mean, with all the technology that's out there, of course we will find out more things about ourselves, about the world around us. And if we just choose to reject all of that information, like if we choose to reject the ideas of evolution or evolutionary theory or something like that, that doesn't make us more faithful people, which is often the idea that you need to strictly take the Bible on faith and read it as strictly historical fact, although that's not usually perpetuated in the Catholic Church as such, but it's still a common theme, and there are certainly subsets of Catholic Christians who believe that that is the case. But there's no real value in ignoring truth when it is readily available to us. And I think for me, my background, among other things, besides moral theology, is also in I worked as a multi-faith minister at Boston College, so I'm appreciative of the truths that can be found in all faiths. And for those who think that's not grounded in Catholic theology, well, Nostra Aetate from Vatican II suggests absolutely that. And this builds on partly on the idea of natural law, which you can talk about if you'd like, but just the idea that there are truths out there that should be readily apparent whether or not you have any exposure to Christianity per se. There are still things that are right and wrong that are apparent to all of us, and whether they happen to come from another faith background or what have you, those are still valid, and we shouldn't be so set on our moral facts as we see them to be unable to learn from moral facts as taught from other faiths.
Yeah, and I think actually Thomas Aquinas is an interesting example of that. And, I mean, Thomas Aquinas, now we have to understand, applying Aquinas to the 21st century is always a move that's anachronistic and a bit dangerous because he
Sure.
lived 700, almost 800 years ago. So the time he was writing in is very different from the time we live in. But Aquinas was one of the first. His teacher, Albert the Great, was the first, but he was one of the first medieval Christian scholars to use Aristotle. And Aristotle was coming to Europe. They had lost Aristotle for the last almost 1,000 years. He came to Europe through the Middle East, through the Muslims. The Muslim scholars were translating Aristotle from Greek into Arabic, and then from Arabic into Latin, and giving it to the Europeans. I mean, this is something we also forget. We actually owe a lot to the Arab. We owe, what is it called? The Arab Golden Age.
Mm-hmm.
But Thomas Aquinas uses Aristotle, and a lot of people at that time said, "Whoa, Aristotle is a pagan. What are you doing using Aristotle? You can't use him. He's not a Christian." But he uses Aristotle almost more than he uses any Christian theologian. He uses the Bible primarily in his discussions, and then I believe it's Aristotle is next and Augustine is third.
Mm-hmm.
So he's one of the first people to say, actually, Aristotle the pagan knows a lot more about how to live a good life than most Christians do. And he's his whole idea of the telos of human life, he does say that we're only perfectly happy with God's grace, but he does think that Aristotle was happy, being a virtuous pagan. He does think that anybody who who develops a good morality will be happy. And he thinks that the principles of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, are available to anybody who applies their reason. Of course, some of them might be less available. Things like, don't take the name of the Lord in vain might be less available to somebody who's a Buddhist, for example. But things like don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't dishonor your parents. Those are things that most people in most societies would agree with. And there's actually a lot of work. Jean Porter, who is a professor who teaches natural law at Notre Dame, writes in one of her books that ethics actually has to be developed in a community, that there is no one rule for everybody, that actually natural law means communal prudence, that as a group we figure out what's going to be best for us. But there are certain things that we will figure out don't work, that going around killing people doesn't work and can't be accepted as a norm, that stealing people's stuff, if we live in a society that has property, can't be a norm, that sexual promiscuity and infidelity can't really be a norm if we're going to have any kind of secure family system, although that's perhaps debatable to a certain extent. But there are certain things that every society will have to have in order for people to flourish. And what's more interesting to me, though, is the development of our thought over time has tended to actually narrow down and to be more appreciative of other people, right? Thomas Aquinas and the virtue ethicists. This is, of course, that I have not a great love for virtue ethics, but one of my problems is that it's very self-centered. largely speaking. Justice might be the primary virtue, but justice then depends on who the other person is. That if I'm asked to do something by the king, even if it means violating justice to another person, I have to do that. If I'm interacting with somebody who's of a lower status than me, according to Thomas Aquinas, I owe him less than I owe somebody else. When you get to Kant in the 18th century, Kant realizes that the condition of morality is based on just being a person, being a rational agent. So that I owe to you what, in broad terms, what I owe to anybody else. That I can't treat you differently from someone else without some sort of special reason. I can't just say, well, you know, Jeff, you're Indian, so I'm going to treat you differently from from a white person because I have to treat you as a rational agent similarly. And then when we get to the 20th century, the development of human rights, these things get much more codified, and we have all of a sudden a list put out by the United Nations of 47 rights that every person should be afforded. And then that's actually expanded over the course of the 20th century. So we see that morality has become more focused. Now, in the time of Thomas Aquinas, the time of Aristotle, the woman didn't matter because she wasn't a fully rational agent. She wasn't given, she couldn't be a virtuous person for Aristotle, or perhaps for Thomas Aquinas. But by the time you get to Kant, she is a rational agent, and you have to treat her as such. By the time you get to the human rights, the codification of human rights, you see, and actually as a person and as somebody who needs certain things to flourish, she deserves these things, and they have to be afforded to her.
Right.
So, yeah, it's more of I think, a stronger focus of our ethics rather than a broadening.
Right, exactly. So to sort of put it all full circle, our impression at least is not that we are suddenly a more morally relativistic society, but rather that maybe as a result of the internet age, maybe as a result of globalization generally, we are more aware of each other and more aware of perhaps some of our shortcomings as moral beings that we've developed through centuries of ignoring certain subsets of the population. And because we're more aware of it, maybe we're less confident in individual instances of trying to ascribe morality to a situation, but it doesn't mean we've suddenly lost our ability to be moral. That we've so awashed ourselves in this idea of moral relativism that we can't confirm or deny that something is a righteous or a wrong and immoral act. So I think that probably about wraps up what we can do for now, since we've been talking for a good while. Do you want to talk a little bit about your upcoming talk in good old Canada?
I guess it's going to be. I'm a bit nervous for it. I'm talking about erotic love for God, which is a very underdeveloped idea, especially in Christianity in general, to a large extent in Catholicism. But I'm using the work of Jean-Luc Marion, who lives in Chicago, and he is the focus of this conference, and our good friend Ed Vosick. And Marion he writes about what eroticism is, and it's kind of, ironically, when I read this book the first time, I read it for a class where there were 10 other students in the class. I was the only married person in the class, and 8 of the other students were religious, either Jesuits or nuns, and it was this sort of like, I felt kind of, I was the one who presented on it, but I felt sort of awkward, like, is it okay to read about, the crossing over of the flesh with these Jesuits? So Marion's work is very much about interpersonal, and it's very much about romantic eroticism. But Vosick's work is much broader, and it's more morally focused. So I'm using the two because they actually complement each other nicely. Vosick does a good job of, this is what we have to do. This is what morality is, in terms of love, and it includes agape, friendship, and eros, and it includes love to ourselves, love to our neighbors, and love to God. And so I'm using just one subset of that, eros towards God, using Marion's idea of what eroticism is, and trying to say, well, then here are some ways we can erotically love God. And it
Mm.
sounds bizarre, but it's not as bizarre as we might think. A lot of it's based in bodily devotion, in expressing love toward God, in either singing hymns, reading the Psalms, praying, even right when you feel great joy, when you feel God's presence, when you cry tears of repentance. A lot of that's erotic love for God. It's loving God for what God does for you. Even a lot of our movements during Mass are meant to sort of bring that about. When we make the sign of the cross, we are loving God in a very embodied way. When we smite our chest in the Confiteor, we're doing something that talks about what we owe God, what God gives us, how we love God. And we're doing it in a very embodied way. So that's what I'm going to be talking about.
All right, that sounds fascinating. I hope it goes well, of course. Best of luck. I don't know, you don't have a Twitter handle or anything like that, right? No way
Not
that,
currently, no.
do you have any way that anybody could communicate with you if they wanted to ask you any sort of questions or anything like that? If not, otherwise, of course, just comment below the video. You can hit me up at a moral action on Twitter or by Gmail, just at a moral action. And as I said at the beginning of the show, and as is always worth remembering, remember that every action is a moral action. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, share it. If not, you can still share it and just say terrible things, and that's fine too. We hope to do this again soon, and we hope you enjoyed it. Take care.